Hi, I'm Drew Sawyer, and I'm the Phillip and Edith Leonian Curator of Photography at the Brooklyn Museum. Today, I'm going to be giving a behind-the-scenes tour of Jimmy DeSana's Submission, which is the first survey exhibition of this significant but overlooked artist. We're in the first section of the exhibition, which is titled Subversion and Liberation, and it looks at DeSana's early work from the late 1960s to the mid-1970s. So over here we have some early photographs taken in a very sort of matter-of-fact way, often, as you can see, with abandoned vehicles in the yard, completely devoid of people. And I kind of think of them as crime scene photographs. And of course here, the crime being post-war suburban America. Is a senior thesis project which is installed on this wall. It's called 101 Nudes. It features 56 photolithographic prints. He made them over the course of several years, and they feature many of his friends who are also BFA students at Georgia State, along with the notorious drag performer Diamond Little, who's photographed here. In New York, DeSana also became friends with a number of slightly older gay male artists. I call this grouping Dada Daddies. Again, it was all artists that were slightly older than him and really served as models and mentors. And many people he met through the correspondence art networks or through other associations. So here, for example, we have William Burroughs. There's also portraits of Andy Warhol, a figure who he became quite close with in the 1970s, Jack Smith, Ray Johnson, and the filmmaker Kenneth Anger. The second section is DeSana's best known work, and it really dives deep into his time from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s in New York City and New York's downtown countercultural movements, especially what is known as no wave, and that includes both music, but also cinema, performance, and even literature. So here we have a wall of some of his most well-known portraits, many of them musicians, in some cases artists such as Laurie Anderson. We have Blondie, we have James Chance. In the cases here, I have some of the examples of the album covers and publications in which a lot of DeSana's photographs appeared. He's shooting installation shots of other artists' exhibitions at commercial galleries and alternative spaces such as PS1. And then he's also producing these portraits and album covers as an additional source of income. So Submission is featured in this room behind me, which we'll take a closer look. This photographic series mostly features DeSana performing for the camera along with some of his friends. They're almost always masked and anonymous. Sometimes they're wearing sort of classic S&M leather masks. In other cases, they're turning their heads away from the camera. And of course, this is important because it meant that these individuals, who are often DeSana's friends, remained anonymous and their identity was protected, especially given the content of some of the images. So this series really plays on the theme of sadomasochism, as does the Dungeon series. And he really uses sort of protocols, practices of S&M. And what I think is really interesting and telling is that DeSana titled these photographs after the objects or spaces that appear in them, and not after sex acts or body parts. So here, right, we have Refrigerator, which features an anonymous woman. This is actually the artist Marcia Resnick, tied up in the refrigerator, or here another one of a man, potentially DeSana, standing or kneeling inside of a toilet. The feature of DeSana's work, at least for me, is his sense of humor. And so many of the images have visual or take on visual puns. And this is a really good example of one of those from the Suburban series. This is Otto from 1980, and it features a nude man, of course, perhaps DeSana or a friend, lying under a vehicle with this sort of red, glowing, ominous light. And the figure appears to be wearing a mask that's hooked to a hose that's connected to the exhaust pipe. And so for me, what comes to mind is autoerotic asphyxiation, of course, the car being the auto, and then the man himself hooking himself up to the exhaust pipe. You'll notice when looking at this work that it's really different from everything that DeSana had been making previously. Before, right, he was usually doing a studio setup involving him and his friends nude. Here he begins exploring darkroom experiments, this time using the Cibachrome printing process, which was in color. So whereas in Suburban he was using gel lighting to imbue his images with these surreal colors, in these images he's actually shooting with black and white film and then adding the color as sort of like a post-production with Cibachrome. Also, you'll notice that he's playing a lot with doubling. Again, surrealism is sort of a through line of DeSana's work in the exhibition. The surrealists of the 20s and 30s and their photographic experiments using solarization, photograms, and other processes. And a lot of those artists played again with doubling in a similar way that DeSana did. Of course, doubling has another connotation for an artist like DeSana, thinking of homoeroticism, right, as a sort of doubling. So here you see a lot of male figures that are doubled. And there's also this sort of doubling that takes place through absence too. So an image like this, which features a solitary man shot from behind with a shadow, or what appears like could be a shadow, that evokes another figure, but also an absence of a figure. And I think that's also really a sort of through line of DeSana's work. So all the work in this section is work that he exhibited at Hearn Gallery in the second half of the 1980s. And it was really with the support of Hearn, who had a fairly large, successful business, that he could start making much more ambitious work. So here, you can really see that on display with these much larger prints, which are 40 by 50 images. Again, continuing the Cibachrome printing process. So these, like the other images we just looked at, are collages that would have been produced in black and white. And then through the printing process, he added additional colors. And this body of work was in his last show at Hearn in 1988, and he really saw this work as reflecting on him living with HIV. And unfortunately, he passed away 2 years later in 1990 from AIDS-related illness. By that point, of course, many of his friends and other artists had already passed away. He also moves increasingly towards abstracting figures. I mean, I think increasingly the sort of bodies become amorphic. These three are probably the best examples of that kind of practice. Of course, this is one of his most well-known photographs, one of the last images that he took of this series in 1982, called Marker Cones, which features a figure crouched, hands and feet in marker cones, which of course evoke maybe sports, but also maybe traffic sort of control. So again, sort of different ways that our bodies are disciplined by society, right? The way that athletics sort of disciplines and shapes our bodies, but also the way that maybe traffic cops, right, sort of force you to move in the world in a certain way. Thank you for joining this tour of Jimmy DeSana's submission. I hope you're as compelled by his work as I am, and his transgressions of photographic norms, his explorations of sexuality and identity in the 1970s and 1980s. It's truly amazing the number of artists I see working today who are exploring similar themes, and so I hope you have a chance to come see the show before it closes on April 16th.